So thanks for coming to this biology session. We're going to do part of lesson 1. It's going to be chapter 4 in the textbook. If you're here live, you're going to see questions come up on the screen as a poll, and those are just for practice. They're not graded. Those are for students to just kind of help keep up and make sure they're understanding everything and to help us see if the students are understanding. So we can see how well the whole class does as far as correct answers, but we can't see what individual students' grades are. And that is a mistake. That should say chapter 4. Sorry about that. So participate in all the quick poll questions, and if you're here live, you can also ask questions. If you're on a computer, you'll see this speech bubble icon. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you'll see this question mark icon. You click on that, and then you can ask questions, and I will answer them. So you can do that at any point. You're not going to interrupt or anything. Just ask anything you need to about this. I can go back and explain anything that you want me to, or I can talk about something else from this lesson. Just ask. And if you're watching a recording instead of watching this live, then you don't have to answer the quick poll questions. Again, they're just here for practice, so you should just be thinking about what the answers are, but there'll be nothing for you to actually click. And at the end, you'll see how you can contact your instructor with other questions. So this chapter is about ecosystems and communities. We start with community is the term for all living things. And we learned in chapter 3 that living things are affected by other living things and their non-living environment. So it's two different terms to think about. Community is the term for all of the living things of various species in the area. So just in this picture, we've got birds, we've got trees, we've got other plants. You won't be able to see them, but there's probably bugs and mice and maybe some squirrels in the trees. It's all the living things that are there. Ecosystem is the term for the community of organisms plus the non-living environment. So all the water and the rocks and the soil and the air, all of that is ecosystem. So ecosystem includes biotic factors, which means living things. Biotic factors. So it does include the trees and the bugs and the birds, and it also includes abiotic factors. Many abiotic factors such as temperature, the amount of water, the gases and particles in the atmosphere, the nutrients in the soil, and more affect the lives of organisms and the entire community in which they live. One major factor of any ecosystem is the climate. Climate is the average conditions of a place. It includes the average temperature and precipitation. It's really important to distinguish between climate and weather. Climate is defined as the average conditions over many years, and weather is short-term conditions over hours or days or months. For example, in Pennsylvania, it got as cold as -3 degrees Fahrenheit last winter, with snow deeper than my dog is tall, and as hot as 95 degrees this summer. But we would not say that the climate changed from winter to summer because these drastic differences are part of the seasonal cycle. So those differences are the conditions of weather. We would describe the climate of northeastern Pennsylvania as having cold, snowy winters and hot, humid summers, and the average conditions as temperate. If we looked at the records for several decades of the weather and the average temperature changed consistently, or maybe the average winter temperature changes or the average amount of precipitation changes, anything that changes over a long period of time, several decades, then we can say the climate has changed. You also may hear of microclimates, which are a set of conditions that exist in small areas. So a good example is in this image, the slope on the left side is facing north and it does not get as much sun. And the slope on the right side is facing south and it's baked by the desert sun all day. So it results in very different amounts of plant growth despite the areas being so close. So that's a microclimate. They're in the same region, they're right next to each other. It's just a very small area that is a little different than the area next to it, but it's consistently different like that because there's a different condition that exists there. Earth's climate as a whole is created by the sun and our atmosphere. The atmosphere lets in some of the energy from the sun, and that is absorbed by the earth and then radiates as heat. Some gases in the atmosphere trap that heat so that it does not escape back into space. Most of it is remaining in the earth. These are called greenhouse gases, and they keep our earth warm enough to live on. If we compare Earth to Mercury, the planet closest to the sun, we should be very grateful to our atmosphere. On Mercury, the side facing the sun reaches temperatures of 800 degrees Fahrenheit. But with no atmosphere to hold in the gases, the dark side is about negative 280 degrees Fahrenheit. So our atmosphere prevents that from happening. It traps in the heat. It keeps our planet to be mostly livable on all sides of it and keeps us from freezing to death just because it gets dark at night. And the amount of solar energy on the Earth, the amount of solar energy absorbed by the Earth is different at different locations. Because the Earth is spherical, areas near the equator are hit with more direct solar energy than areas near the North and South Pole. As a general rule, the climate is hot near the equator and gets cooler as distance from the equator increases. We call the hot area near the equator tropical, or the tropics. The middle latitudes are temperate, and the areas farthest from the equator are polar. So you can kind of think of it as the same amount of sunlight is coming towards the Earth, but here it's concentrated, and here it's spread out. So if you looked at 1 square mile down here, it would be receiving more sunlight per square mile than it would be up near the poles. And it's also the same down here, down near the South Pole, it would also be spread out. Because Earth's axis is tilted, one hemisphere is pointing towards the sun and one is pointing away from the sun at any given time. This gives us seasons. Where the northern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun, it is winter. And, oh, what did I say? I'm sorry, when the northern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun, it is summer in the northern hemisphere and winter in the southern hemisphere. Then, as the Earth moves around the sun, this changes, and the northern hemisphere ends up pointing away from the sun, and it's winter there. Climate change is happening because we have increased the number of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, making the greenhouse effect too strong. This means that the same amount of solar energy is reaching the Earth, but less of it can escape back into space, increasing the average temperature on Earth. So most solar energy arrives in the tropics, but it is transported around the world by wind and ocean patterns. Warm air rises in the tropics and moves north and south and then sinks. cold air from the poles moves across the Earth's surface. Meanwhile, the winds moving over the ocean push water on the surface, creating currents and lifting cold water from the depths of the ocean. These air and water currents are the main drivers of climates, creating biomes with different temperatures and different amounts of precipitation. Okay, so that's actually the end of section 1. So I'm going to bring up a poll for you to answer. So this is going to pop up on your screen, and you can think about it and answer the question. So um, if you didn't hear me say before, I can't see your specific answer. I can only see the answers of the class in general and see what percentage of you get it right. So don't be afraid to answer this. And I do need to get some responses so that we can move on. So I'm going to read the question and then I'll give you a few seconds to answer it. So what is true about areas in the tropics? They receive less sunlight per unit of area than the polar regions. They receive more sunlight per unit of area than the polar regions. They receive the same amount of sunlight per unit area as the polar regions. They receive higher frequency sunlight or lower frequency sunlight than the polar regions. So only one of these answers is true. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to think about it and answer it. Again, there should just be a poll on the screen you can click on. Okay, so not sure what's going on, why we didn't get any answers, but we're going to have to go over it. So which is true about areas in the tropics? So, oops. Very solid. Here we go. Okay, so first of all, it says they receive less sunlight per unit of area than the polar region. So what do we mean by that? Well, a unit of area just means we're measuring a certain amount of area. So let's just use a square mile, for example. So we're saying the tropical regions receive less sunlight per square mile than the polar regions. Well, that's definitely not true. We know that tropical regions are hotter. It's because they're receiving more sunlight. So that's actually our answer. They receive more sunlight per unit of area. Whoops. It's hard to draw with this mouse. Unit of area than the polar regions. So that makes this one false too. They don't receive the same amount. They receive more. They don't receive less. They receive more. And these bottom two are just here to kind of throw you off. They receive higher frequency or lower frequency. That's not anything. The sun is just putting out the same amount of frequency, sunlight, to the whole Earth. So our correct answer is the tropics receive more sunlight per unit of area than the polar regions do. Okay, so now we're jumping into Chapter 4, Section 2. We're talking about habitats and niches. A habitat is the general place where an organism lives. Each species requires certain conditions to live and survive. Penguins would not survive in the desert, and rattlesnakes would not survive in the icy Antarctic Ocean. So those are pretty extreme examples, but all organisms have a range in which they can survive. There we go. There are values too low or too high at which none survive. So that would be here, below this point, none of them survive. And above this point, none of them survive. And this could be measuring anything at all. So we just have survival rate on the side here. I didn't label the x-axis at all because this could be lots and lots of different things. This could be temperature. So if we think back to the penguins and the rattlesnakes, they can both survive at certain temperatures. It could be too cold and they would die. It could be too hot and they would die. Somewhere in between, they'd all live. But there's lots and lots of different factors that this could be. It could be the amount of predators nearby. It could be the acidity of the water. It could be the salinity of the water. It could be the amount of nutrients in the soil. Lots and lots of different things that could be here. The amount of precipitation. So any condition, you can make a chart like this and see the range. So there are values too low and too high for it to survive. So the red lines mark that. And there are in between, you have an optimum range. So this dark blue area, this is where the survival rate is highest. So whatever our factor is, let's just say it's temperature, our species does the best at this median temperature right in the middle. And then in between that and the outer limits, you have these areas where some of them survive, but it's a bit of a struggle. It's not an optimum range for them to be in. It's like their limits of being, it's really cold or it's really hot. They're not doing so great. The survival rate is pretty low, but some of them do survive. So what we're looking at is a range of tolerances. We call these ranges the minimum here and the maximum over here. Though that is the range of tolerance in which the organism can live. So anything lower than that, they die. Anything higher than that, they die. But remember that the tolerance is just the uttermost extremes, but you've also got this nice area in the middle where most of them survive. And you've got these areas on the side where most of them die, but some of them live. Okay, so again, if this was temperature, this here would be the best range where it's just warm enough, it's not too hot, it's not too cold. These ranges here, the medium blue on the side, that's where, over here it's getting too cold, a lot of them can't stay alive. And over here it would be getting too hot, a lot of them can't stay alive. And then the edges are the outer limits where none of them can stay alive past that point. So along with factors like that, there are resources that limit the number of individual organisms that can be in the habitat, and individuals compete for those resources. For example, plants compete for water and for space in the sunlight. Animals compete for mates and for food and for shelter and water. And there are two kinds of competition. You have intraspecific competition, which is competition between the members of the same species, such as males competing for mates or groups competing for territory. For example, these male hartebeests are competing for dominance. Then there's interspecific competition, and that's competition between members of different species, often for food or space. For example, these hyenas and lions are competing for the same dinner. Each species has a unique role to play in its ecosystem called a niche. It describes how the species interacts with the environment, how it obtains resources, and the job that it does in the community. No two species can occupy the exact same niche in the same habitat. If they do, there would be a winner and a loser, and the loser species dies out. This is called the competitive exclusion principle, that no two species can occupy the exact same niche. So to avoid this, what happens most often is that all the resources are divided and each species takes example of a certain part. For example, these species of birds all live in the same habitat and use the same trees, so they divide up the tree. Some of them use the branches high up. Some of them use the branches near the bottom. And some of them use the edges of the tree, and some of them hang out closer to the trunk. So this is a really specific, really detailed way to divide this resource, but there's lots and lots of ways that different organisms divide resources so that they all can get what they need and they're not directly in competition with each other. So in each ecosystem, there must be a sustainable balance between members of the community. If there are too many herbivores, which are animals that eat the plants can't survive, and then the whole ecosystem can be ruined. You get what's called desertification, where land starts to turn into a desert. Predation, which is animals eating other animals, keeps the number of herbivores in check, helping this not to happen. But if there are too many predators, then the prey species can die out, and the plants can grow unchecked, but then the predator species is in trouble. So there has to be a delicate balance of keeping just the right number of predators and prey. The relationships between organisms can be complex, and often ecosystems have keystone species. These are species whose actions directly and indirectly affect many species in the ecosystem, and if they disappear, the whole ecosystem can be ruined. And let's look at some especially close relationships in a community. Any organisms of different species that live almost all of their life together are called symbiosis. There are three versions of symbiosis. In mutualism, both species benefit. A great example is bees and flowering plants. The plants feed the bees and the bees pollinate the plants. Both species benefit and neither is harmed. In parasitism, one organism harms the other to help itself. An example of this is a tick living on an animal, taking small amounts of its blood. The third type of symbiosis is commensalism, where one species benefits and the other is indifferent. An example of this is a bird building a nest in a tree. The bird is getting a safe home, and the tree is not helped or harmed. And we want to note that one animal killing and eating another is not a form of symbiosis, for the two organisms are not living together. So that's different than parasitism, where one organism harms another, but it generally keeps it alive. And then commensalism, again, was where one benefits and the other one doesn't benefit or get hurt. And I'm sorry, we had a review question. All right. The competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can share the same what. So there's your options. I'm going to bring this poll up. If you're here, you can answer the poll. Competitive exclusion principle says that no two species can share the same source of food, habitat, or niche. So I'll give you about 20 seconds to answer that one. Okay, awesome. The people that participated all put the correct answer of niche. Okay, so let's look at what's wrong with the other ones. So the competitive exclusion principle, it doesn't say that species can't share the same source of food. Okay, we know intraspecific competition exists. We just saw a picture of lions and hyenas eating the same dead animal. So they can share the same source of food as long as they don't share everything else. So a niche is basically everything that describes the animal's role in the ecosystem or the plant. It could be any organism, their role in the ecosystem. So some of it can overlap. They might share the same source of food or something like that, but their entire niche can't be the same. Okay, so the first one's not right. About habitat, the problem with that is that we know that organisms can share the same habitat. Habitat is just the area where they live. So you can just look outside your window and see that there's lots of organisms in one area. There's grass and trees and birds and bugs and squirrels all in the same place. So that's not right. So the only answer is niche. No two species can share the same niche. So a great example is these birds. They have the same source of food. They all eat bugs. They have the same habitat. You can see they're all living around this tree. So their niche is going to be differentiated by where they hunt for their food and where they build their nests. So again, some of them are down here, some of them are in the middle, some of them are on the top, some of them are on the outer edges, some of them are in close to the trunk. And again, that's a really specific version of differentiating that resources. Most things are a little less close than that, but it's just a great example to show that they work out a way for all of them to survive without competing. All right, so we're going to go into the next section, which is about succession. So communities change over time, and there are predictable patterns of changes when a community is built, and that pattern is called ecological succession. And there are two types of ecological succession. Primary succession begins with no ecosystem at all, maybe a volcanic eruption or a glacier left an area with nothing but bare rock. And then the first species to live in that bare area is called a pioneer species. Though actually the pioneer species is usually two species working together, a fungus and an algae that grow together, and they make what's called lichen, which is what this picture is. And the lichen can live on rocks. They slowly create soil, and other small species begin to grow. These also alter the environment, making it easier for more species to survive. And this takes years. This takes many, many years, like 100 years minimum, usually much longer, to go all the way from no anything, just bare rocks, to go to having a completed, entire forest. Over time, larger and more diverse species move into the area. So you can also see it started out with no soil, and then as things keep growing and dying and growing and dying and growing and dying, they're making more and more soil. And then that soil can support more and more life. So that is called primary succession, when it starts with nothing at all except bare rock. Then we have secondary succession, which happens more quickly because it doesn't start from bare rock. Secondary succession occurs when a community is mostly wiped out, such as after a forest fire, but the soil and some organisms living in it remain. So we had a community, then there's a fire, and now there's just soil and some leftovers. So it's much better than starting from bare rock where there's no soil, it can barely support life. This way we're starting from something. So it goes much faster. Secondary succession works in less than 100 years. It still seems like it would be bad and a problem, but the situation can actually be good for the community. It allows small plants to get a chance to grow without the trees crowding them out, and it leads to more species diversity. And there's actually some trees who are adapted to this situation. Their seeds don't germinate until after they have gone through a fire. There's several species around the world of trees that do this in places where wildfires are common. So they don't germinate until after they've gone through a fire, and that way they can sprout and grow quickly as the dominant tree because all the other trees have been wiped out. Succession goes through several phases, and the end result is a community called the climax community. However, because of disturbances that occur while succession is happening, the climax communities, even in the same biome, could be completely different. And they might be different from the original community that happened before secondary succession. So you might have had a community and then a fire, and then secondary succession happens, and you end up with a completely different type of community with different life. They are often stable, but sometimes there's places where disruptions happen often, so even the climax community is unstable. And sometimes humans who cause the original disturbance can also make changes that prevent the community from ever being restored to a climax community. Okay, so quick review question about succession. Oh, I might have screwed this one up. Okay, this is supposed to be one with more than one answer, and I didn't set it up that way. I'm so sorry. So I'm not even going to launch this as a poll. We're just going to skip over it, but I'll just go through our answers. So which are true about secondary succession? Does it start on bare rock? Does it start with soil? Does it take over 100 years, less than 100 years? Does it result in a climax community? So we'll just look at each option here. Secondary succession does not start on bare rock. That's only primary succession. Instead, it starts with soil. And it does not take over 100 years. That's primary succession. Instead, secondary succession takes less than 100 years. So we need to make sure we remember the difference between the two of them. Primary succession is just bare until that first pioneer species gets it all started. Secondary succession, soil, and there's probably some things living in the soil, and so it's got a head start. And both of them result in a climax community. So we mentioned before that distance from the equator and wind and global ocean currents work together to create different climates in different areas of the world. There's also other factors like mountain ranges and distance from the ocean that can affect regional climate. So this is a great example. We see this in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, where you have winds coming from the sea and they bring a lot of rain with them. Well, they bring a lot of moisture. And as it goes up over the mountain, it drops all that moisture as rain. So this side has a lot of rain. And then as the air goes up over, it's dry. It dropped all the rain over here and there's no moisture left. So over here, it's really dry. So you're going to have very different habitats over here where it's rainy and it rains a lot versus on this side of the mountain where everything is dry. So that's just an example of another factor that helps to create regional climates. And what we call these regional climates are called biomes. And the textbook describes 10 different biomes described by their climates, soil, and the types of organisms that live there. So we don't have time to go over all 10 of them, but read pages 92 and 94 in the text to get a description of each type of biome and a general idea of where they are in the earth. So you can kind of see some patterns where we have desert biomes and other dry ones. Here you've got temperate biomes further in the mid-latitudes, the temperate zones, and then you have colder ones up here, but they've all got specific descriptions explaining why they're from different. Your textbook also notes that, but each section of a mountain is not usually classified as a separate biome. Polar ice caps are also listed as one of these weird exceptions that are not easy to define as a biome. So, our last section. Up till now, we have been using ecosystems on the land as all of us because that's what we're most familiar with. But all the concepts we have described apply to ecosystems underwater as well. They have different conditions based on temperature and salinity and the acidity of the water and other factors. They have communities of organisms that thrive in different conditions. Individual species have individual niches between organisms in the community. So let's look at what conditions underwater. Well, water depth is important, and this is because the pressure changes and because sunlight only reaches to shallow distances. So some organisms thrive in the light and others in the dark. Many organisms live on the floor of the body of water, which is called the benthic zone, while others live suspended in the deep water. Temperature is a major factor in determining which organisms live in a body of water, and the availability of oxygen and nutrients is variable in different bodies of water. And some words you're going to see here are photic and aphotic. So photo and photic are words that mean light. So the photic zone is where there's sunlight, and the aphotic zone is where there's no sunlight. So it's very dark down here. And they show this twilight zone in the middle where there's just a little bit of light. Freshwater ecosystems, which are rivers and lakes and wetlands, they're different from marine ecosystems, which is saltwater. In rivers and streams, water flows and takes sediment with it, changing the landscape. In lakes and ponds, where the water moves much less, the bottom of the food chain is usually plankton, which are tiny plant or animal organisms that drift in the water. And wetlands are very important. Wetlands are areas where shallow water lays on the soil for at least part of the year. And these ecosystems are very important for organisms both in the water and on the surrounding land. Wetlands produce a lot of nutrients, and they act as natural filters for water, and they act as buffers during floods to help the dry land from getting too flooded. Estuaries are wetlands that form where a river meets the ocean. Estuaries are unique in that they contain a mix of fresh water and salt water. Like other wetlands, they are very important ecosystems, producing a lot of life and a lot of nutrients and serving as a breeding ground for many species. Marine ecosystems, and again, marine means salt water, they are classified by depth and by distance from the shore. So let's check out distance from the shore. Intertidal zones are areas that are covered with water during high tide and then exposed to the air during low tide. Then you have coastal oceans, which are relatively shallow oceans over the continental shelves, generally within 500 kilometers of shore. Further out in the ocean floor drops steeply, creating the deep open ocean. And while intertidal zones and coastal seas are shallow enough that light can penetrate all the way to the bottom, that makes the entire thing a photic zone. This is not the case in the open ocean. Below about 200 meters, there is no light at all, and this is the aphotic zone. And all areas at all depths have a benthic zone, the area where the water meets the ocean floor. And that brings us to the end of this section. I have one more review question for you. So, organisms that live deep in the open ocean. So, which is true? This is one where there's only one correct answer. So they rely on photosynthesis because it's a photic zone, rely on photosynthesis because it's an aphotic zone. They can't use photosynthesis because it's a photic zone, and can't use photosynthesis because it's aphotic. So there's a couple things to pay attention to with each answer. I'm going to launch the poll, give you about 20 seconds to think about it, and then answer. Okay, doesn't look like we do, okay, good. So we got an answer, or a couple. And it looks like most people said rely on photosynthesis because it's a photic zone. So this is a bit of a problem. So our question is organisms that live deep in the ocean. So when we're deep in the open ocean, there's no light. So if there's no light, there can't be, oh, so there's the answer. So here's why. If there's no light, there can't be any photosynthesis. So we learned back, actually, we go over photosynthesis in detail in lesson 2. I think it's mentioned earlier though. This is what plants use to make food, and it comes from sunlight. So if we're deep in the open ocean where there's no light, there can't be any photosynthesis. And if there's no light, it's not a photic zone. So photic means it has light, and it does not. So that means the first one can't be right. The second one also says rely on photosynthesis, so that's wrong. And the third one cannot use photosynthesis, so okay, that part's good. There's no light, so there's no photosynthesis. But the second half is wrong because it is a photic zone. So it is not. It's not photic. The word that means it's not photic, there's no light, is aphotic. All right, so this is a bit of a complex question because I wanted to kind of throw both ideas in there at once. If there's no light because you're deep in the open ocean, the zone is called aphotic. Aphotic as one word, that means there's no light there. And if there's no light, there's no photosynthesis. So that actually brings us to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions and you're here live, you can totally ask them. I'll hang out for a few more minutes and you can ask questions. If you get questions later or you're watching a recording and you have questions, here are a couple ways that you can contact an instructor.